Welcome to Adventures of Alice and Bob, the podcast where we get root access to the people shaping the world of cybersecurity today and find out a little about their journey, the events that shaped their career, and the things that still keep them up at night. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Ana Aslanishvili, founder and CEO of Pine Risk Management. Ana has a really unique background, having grown up in the Republic of Georgia after the fall of the Soviet Union, moving to the United States, where she started a career in finance and anti-money laundering investigations, and then went on to become a leader in physical security red teaming. Her expertise spans from testing high-security environments like banks to accessing executive protection scenarios and evacuating buildings just to test what happens when that big red button is pressed. Ana is a passionate advocate for holistic approaches to red teaming, and whether it's through her board membership at CART, the Center for Advanced Red Teaming, standing up the largest physical red team in Silicon Valley, or publishing educational content such as Lessons Learned Register that she maintains on her website that helps red teamers old and new learn from real-world teachable moments. She's constantly focused on moving the industry forward. So Ana, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So usually when we do these podcasts, we start off with people's journeys about how they first became interested in technology and that kind of first computer that they had. But I think actually your journey starts with people and community, and that's a theme that seems to have run throughout your career. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to ask initially how growing up in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a time of immense turmoil and very real dangers, how did that shape the way you think about the world and the journey you've been on with your career today?
In many ways, that really is a through line through everything. Looking back, we kind of gained that wisdom in retrospect. But yeah, I had kind of a rough childhood growing up. There was a lot of unrest, military, civil, but I really didn't feel any of that as a kid growing up. We have a very cross-generational kind of community, and so people just looked up for each other. Our neighbors, our family, our friends. And so everyone is kind of has each other's back. And so I didn't realize this until later, but through a lot of my jobs and, all of us in security kind of have this unconventional, windy path into it. But it was shaped a lot by wanting to help people and kind of recreate that same sense of community and safety. And it turns out that if you do that long enough, then you kind of find yourself in a space where I eventually ended up, which is offensive security. So it's trying to get ahead of the bad guys. It's trying to get ahead of some of these situations that will cause inevitably turmoil for others and trying to prevent, whether it's incidents or the aftermath that follows the incidents, but create safe spaces and not just a sense of security, but actual security for people. So,
yeah. No, thank you for sharing that, because it is a theme, especially with people who do physical engagements, that they often have something kind of in the back of their mind. They have an awareness of threats from a young age, or they're hyper-vigilant around things. So it's always interesting to understand how people have approached this. And then I believe as a teenager, you decided to move somewhere. Unfortunately, you didn't move somewhere warmer. You moved to Minnesota, which I think is actually slightly colder than Georgia. What were you interested in at the time when you moved? What was your experience of moving country like?
It is significantly colder than Georgia. It's in fact one of the coldest places I still have been. Maybe Iceland in August notwithstanding, but it was more of an opportunity leap type of thing. So I unfortunately had made up my mind very early on that Georgia wasn't my long-term home, and so I had my sails set for Europe for a long time, and then kind of as college approached, my dad, who had moved to U.S. earlier on in the 90s, he was like, you should come here and get an education and see how that feels. And maybe you'll want to stay here. Maybe you can always go back to Europe type of thing. And I moved here in 2008. And as you can see, some 17 years later, I'm still very firmly planted here. So it wasn't really a plan to stick around, but it was for education and kind of that experience of like global community, coming over, meeting different kinds of people. My English wasn't very good when I moved, so that was part of it too. Lots of things teenagers think about in terms of their future. They're like, America sounds cool, let's do this.
Absolutely. No, that's a good a reason as any, isn't it? That then, as you establish yourself in the US. I was interested to see that you'd studied both a BA in Communications and Youth Work, and then went on to a Master's in Security Technologies. What was it about those two sort of what I see as quite contrasting subjects that interested you?
So that's interesting. I think one of the ways I've again looked at it from, my sage wisdom of this age is I was pretty lost. I think as a lot of college freshmen are, and one of the things they always loved and gravitated towards was people. And so one thing is that communication helped me, like studying communication helped me bridge some of that gap with the language, with the customs and the rules of being here. And with the youth work, it's social study. It's social work. And so again, it kind of goes back to me wanting to form that community, be a part of something greater, help people in a way that I can. And so it was that work with people and maybe elevate their voices a little bit, because the communications degree, as I candidly will say that it's kind of useless because it's very broad, right? It's a very general area, but it helped me, give me some of the tools to be able to speak to greater things that I didn't necessarily have the words for, didn't exactly have the rhetoric for at the time. And so it helps form narratives better. And now, I use it a lot because in red teaming space particularly, people don't always want to hear what you have to say. There's all this expectation that you'll come in and point fingers and cast blame on somebody. And it's like, you have to be very diplomatic in how you relay the findings. And that degree, laughingly, has helped me a lot. But when I was in finance for first half of my career, I just was like, why? Why did I do that? So the master's in technology then was far more aligned with what I'm actually interested in and passionate about. And it combined this risk management, risk policy, critical infrastructure protection, and a lot of these kind of greater security topics that were really zeroed in because it was obviously a graduate degree, but that's where I found red teaming. And so before then, I was doing anti-money laundering investigations, organized crime, human trafficking, narcotics trafficking, and I was just finding myself constantly a few steps behind the adversaries or the bad guys, right? They didn't have the same infrastructure lag. They didn't have the same policy lag. They kind of had a mission and they were just like, all right, we're going to throw our resources into achieving that mission. And getting this degree, I was like, maybe I can speak to this more. Maybe I can kind of affect it a little bit higher up instead of just as a investigator, kind of an individual contributor level. And then I kind of fell in love with red teaming, which until then I didn't really know was a profession and existed in this type of format, I guess. Like, you've seen movies, right? Everyone's seen movies, but I never thought this was a job outside of like this highly specialized operative groups and you have to be a SEAL or you have to be MI something, for that to be applicable to you. And I wouldn't exactly equate our training to nation state level, but there's a few overlapping elements. So it's very fun and it's very interesting.
I think it's really interesting that you identified, like, with that hindsight, that combination of communication skills and also then security knowledge, because it's a theme that over the past few years doing this podcast, it comes up time and time again when we talk to people who are, whether it's, pen testing engagements, red teaming, physical or, online or whatever it is they're doing. When we ask them for advice, they're like, learn how to communicate better. We have lots of technical people, but they're often very bad at communicating the problems. And, I think one of the things that, in fact, I'm going to play back a quote of yours because I think this explains it quite well, is, could you explain to the audience why you shouldn't cut a birthday cake with a chainsaw?
Oh. That's funny. No one has ever quoted me to me before, so this is fun. But yeah, because it gets the job done, but is it really how you want to get this job done, right? And so the goal of taking that more finessed, more gentle approach is to make sure that everyone still remembers you're on the same team. And so I think that's a message that gets lost a lot because it's like, oh, red team, purple team, blue team, all these teams. But ultimately, we are the security team. And so a lot of times when I'm speaking, especially to cyber folks, I like to say that the red team is a blue team in disguise. we're not your real adversary. We just play one on TV. Like, we're here to get that external perspective, to get that validation or lack of validation for our controls. But, if done correctly, it's going to help you do your job that much better. Because as a blue teamer, you're just, right, like, you have a litany of tasks and fixes and vulnerabilities, and it doesn't end. But getting a red team assessment can give you that priority of like, okay, this is critical. We need to drop everything and fix this right now. And it kind of reshapes how the general security organization approaches it. So yeah, if you want to go easy and you want to use a butter knife, and you want to make very clear, determined slices, because otherwise you just make a big mess. And that it ultimately, other than hurt feelings and other than, potentially disrupted business, it can create an incident down the road. And you really want to avoid that, because red teams are high risk activities to begin with. And so one of the biggest things that I advocate for is, let's create as little risk beyond just a specified activity as possible. So there's no room to introduce undue risk to the business or to the team or to the process that you're testing. There's no place for that. So you want to take slow, deliberate steps.
Yeah, and I love the way you talk about, the birthday cake with the chainsaw thing really stuck for me, of that concept of, I think you also say you've got to meet people in the middle. And that's some advice you got earlier in your career that you've kind of, I think, would you say that understanding of that statement has evolved over time?
It has. When I first heard that, and this is a director of mine at Facebook at the time, and the question I asked was, what's the key to success here? Like, how can I make sure that, my work is added value? And his answer was very brief, as was his manner, but he's like, meet people where they are. And at the time, we were a global company, obviously, and very dispersed. So my thinking was like, do this in person, meet them in their office or meet them at their site or whatever. And over time in their role, and obviously since then, it's meet them where they are, with their level of risk, their level of understanding, their level of expectations, though sometimes those are a little trickier to navigate. But you have to make sure that your work is being heard, but it can only be as well heard as you kind of set up the circumstances to be. So if you put people on the defensive, or if you come in swinging, or if you let your own ego as a red team or as an operative get in the way, then it makes it that much more difficult for the other person to hear you and hear what you're actually saying. Like, hey, ultimately the answer is this control doesn't work. And if this control doesn't work, then that means it's a risk for the company. But if they're caught up in, well, Ana said this, or, they feel like they're attacked, it's a difficult dance, but you have to figure out how to do it. And so if you have a better understanding of where your audience stands, whether that's awareness of red team protocol or your philosophy or the values that kind of guide how you do assessments, you have to talk to them and set that initial foundation of, we're not here to make anyone look bad. We're here to support the business. We have the same mission at the end of the day. We just go about it slightly more differently.
So you mentioned there that kind of early learning was when you joined Facebook, now Meta. I mean, a company of that scale, there must have been an overwhelming amount of potential scope for red teaming exercises. Where did you even start in that journey? How did you approach doing red teaming within Facebook?
So we were the physical security red team. Obviously, there's a massive cyber team there, and we partnered very closely with them. We have wonderful relationships to this day with those teammates. It started with questions. It started with understanding where people are so we could meet them there. But we try to kind of start with a couple things and then grow within that, right? Build reputation, build trust. This is very much a build trust requirement industry, right? You're not gonna just point to the most important thing, the most valuable asset in your company and be like, all right, you go get the person off the street. Like, you have to establish that some of the same things I was talking about. You want to make sure your values are known, that you're not there to make anyone look bad. You're not here to make a noise for the sake of making noise. And so people have to really know that your actions align with what you're saying. And so it took some time to understand the lay of the land a little bit, but then we started with office assessments and then grew from there. And ultimately, over the 4 years that I was there, we did everything from offices to data centers to supply chain, event security, lots of things in the middle. We kind of specialize in testing the untestable. And so and let me just back up a little bit. So one of the ways we approach red teaming in general is we do threat modeling. So we use intelligence, company internal intelligence in terms of what's important, and then obviously external intelligence in terms of who are the threat actors, what are their tactics, what are some of the incidents that have happened to similar companies or companies that have X or Y that we have in common. And so we kind of create this threat model. It's usually a fairly involved process, and that guides a lot of our testing needs. And obviously, there's still a lot of steps there with getting stakeholder buy-in, making sure it's approved, building the actual operation, everything else. If you want to talk about these steps, I'm happy to talk about these steps, but I know we have a somewhat limited time. But everything starts with intelligence, and so we will typically begin there and then build these particular operations to support separate objectives or separate missions. And so the testing, the untestable bit comes from high importance figures with a company. So whether that's folks in C-suite, whether that's folks on the board, them being targeted, whether it's in person, in protests, in deliveries of mail and other packages, etc. So it really depends on what the threat profile looks like, A, and then B, what the risk appetite for testing such things is. And so a lot of the times we will have to do a little bit of a dance with executive protection and the security team and the specific areas that protect a process or an asset themselves. And so we kind of, it takes a lot of getting together in the same room and setting parameters. But we have tested executive protection systems and executive protection teams and mail screening, for example, which is somewhat unusual for red teams, but I think very, very important. But it takes a lot of dancing and diplomacy to get in those rooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I know the audience are always fascinated by these things, and there's obviously, like you say, we've only got a certain amount of time, and with all of these engagements, there's a huge amount behind the scenes in terms of prep and risk reduction and things. But I think I know that the audience love hearing about these stories, so maybe you can tell us about that executive protection thing, because I believe there was a time you, I'm going to use a terrible pun here, I'm going to say you ended up in the doghouse when red teaming a CEO's home security. So maybe you can paint the scope of about what that engagement was and how you approached that.
Yes, absolutely. So for one of our assignments, and this is earlier in our career, we the goal was to test any vectors that may get us in close proximity to CEO and thus either endanger the CEO or any conversations, decisions, acquisitions, anything like that she may be making in regards to the company, so that it's kind of both a human risk and then the business risk. And we thought about it. Okay, we're looking at the office, and every time we're surveilling the office, when we think she's going to come in, there's kind of an entourage of security with her. She's never really left alone. She pulls up to the door and gets swapped right in. It's very difficult to get a gauge on like an opening, right? You can't really plan on it. And so we're doing surveillance, and then we started doing surveillance at the office and at her residential address, because obviously these people, even though they're important, they're still people, and you can usually find their information online. And we're very skilled in getting information that may be applicable to this. And so we started doing residential surveillance as well. And not to say that there weren't executive protection details there. Obviously there were, and the residential team was there. But what we found out is that not unlike in the interviews, she actually does go for a run every morning. And so that was kind of our opening. It's like, okay, what's going to happen if we just get here a little bit earlier and watch for that run, watch for that routine to take place. And so by having a couple days of recurring, she runs by our car at, within a certain window in the morning. There's a van that's following behind her at a certain distance. We were able to interfere, and someone was a neighbor was walking a dog, and they kind of jaywalked in front of the van and kind of separated her from her detail. And we just set up a situation where obviously this is proof of concept. This is obviously, again, undue risk stays at the at the threshold of these doors. And so we just set up one of our operatives to walk just to meet her basically on her running path, and did a wave and a hello. But what I didn't mention is that we also had a van. And so our van was just following along her while that disruption was taking place with her security detail. And so we just had to show that, okay, we can drive along her and have a person on the ground that can basically help throw her in the car if necessary and drive away. And then bad things typically happen. You've seen movies, but we just did a friendly wave and a drive-by. But one of the ways, until we found out that this jog is more or less consistent with our schedule in town, she had a family and they had several kids, and kids are really difficult to test, and we don't ever even go near kidnapping scenarios or anything silly like that. What we're able to find, however, is if someone's posting pictures on social media, so we go kind of down these rabbit holes of what's available to people out there. But before the jog situation was successful, they also have dogs. And so what we're able to determine is that they have a dog walker for said dog. And so the thinking was that, hey, maybe we leave the CEO alone, but we could target the dog walker and have a run-in at the park so we can clip a listening device to the collar because, again, or, just kind of plant it on the dog because they make them really small these days. And odds are that if you're in a house and you're taking meetings, your dog is probably laying near you, which I know mine is across the room and looks like so is yours. Yeah. And so it was just one of the ways where we can not really do any tangible harm in terms of scaring somebody or posing these dangerous situations, but we could just have all that same access and same information to very, very sensitive company information and the direction of this firm and where it's going. So we sit down and we have devious hours, what we call poison circles, all the ways that we could target this person. How might these scenarios play out? What might we do? And then we kind of pick the most reasonable and likely ones. So the bad actors tend to go for the simplest, most effective scenario. And it tends to be a short line, and it's not always a straight line, but it's a much shorter line. And so we emulate that if we know that that's their tactic.
Then, it's fascinating the way you approach it, because often when people think about these kind of engagements, sometimes they assume it's kind of a bit like a capture the flag, right? You've got one objective, you just do that one thing, but obviously there you're kind of wargaming different scenarios and then proving out the most likely of them and coming with a bit of a broader view for the client there. But when it gets to something like the client's, like you said, family there, pets, the way they're running, how do you then handle that conversation in a sensitive way to explain to them kind of, we're not here to harm you, we're here to help you? Do they always take it well, or can that be a very difficult conversation to have?
Well, it can be a difficult conversation to have 100%, because you're already kind of living in that tense environment where someone could be after you, right? And so the message there is, let's find out where the weak spots are, because if you're already worried about it, let's actually focus that concern and ideally alleviate it. And so what happened as a result of our operation was that she got a running buddy. And so running buddy, not everyone's super fired up about it, but it's something that happened, and it also created a stronger relationship between her and her detail, right? And so ultimately, that's what you want. You want to be able to trust the people that are there to secure you. And for this particular scenario, we were lucky that she was a big supporter of red teaming and she was all for it. But it's not always so simple. And sometimes it's like, okay, your insurance company mandates that this testing happens, or your regulations mandate that this testing happens, or your executive protection detail requires for that to happen. But it is ultimately for their own security. And so usually that is the best way we can approach it, because it's not for me to have fun and, rent a white van with a sliding door. It's to make sure that one of the most important symbols of the company is actually safe. And so what we've done in the past, if we are given room to do that, and every company will be very different, is we do kind of field exercises with the executive protection teams, whether that's your residential team, your travel team, your send ahead team, or the personal detail. We'll do a little bit of more of that capture the flag that you were mentioning, or we'll do a tag exercise, or like, okay, we're going to start following them, see if they're able to notice how far we take it. Then it really depends on the leadership appetite, but those conversations have to happen. Even if you're choosing not to test your teams, then that has to be a conversation that happens, because otherwise you're just kind of relying on luck, because ultimately an incident not happening is not because you're successful and very good at security all the time. It can be just because your turn hasn't come yet. And not to, scare anybody and be fear-mongering here, but red teams are one of the more unique ways to test how your security holds up. The other way is to have an actual incident. Because if you think about it, no one else really goes hands-on. And this is specific for the physical. In the cyber realm, it's a little bit different, and people are far more interested in finding out where the weaknesses are and where the gaps are. Physical security, not so much. And we have a lot of measures to kind of bridge some of the gaps, but ultimately it ends up being the Swiss cheese model, where if there's even a little bit of a hole, it will find its way. And so we go hands-on, and then we give you that information, and hopefully we can together come up with a mitigation that bridges that gap and closes that vulnerability, because otherwise you will find out during an incident, and there's no telling on how that actually goes with a real situation unfolding.
Yeah, so at that kind of level of simulation, the activities you're undertaking are focused on finding a vulnerability effectively before someone else exploits that for malicious purposes. And in some cases, like you're saying, these could be threats to people's life or acts of terrorism. And the thing you mentioned earlier was mail screening, right? So that strikes me as something that, how do you talk us through how you take a company and test whether they're screening mail in a way that's realistic enough that you're effectively testing the controls without causing mass panic?
Right. Yeah, so we briefly touched on the risk management aspect of red team operations, and I think we could do a whole week-long episode on that. I'm a very avid and vocal believer, and so we run our red teams very safely. And that means for my operatives on the ground, as much as for the company and the client, as much as for our own company, right? And so a lot of conversations happen, and ultimately one of the ways we take approach is we can test the process, we can test the people, and we can test the technology. And so you can kind of focus on one of those areas depending on where you feel you're strongest or weakest, or you can kind of do a series of a crawl, walk, run type model where you're like, okay, we think we're doing good in this, and we want to build something, so help us kind of build something good. And there's companies that will sell inert or 98% inert substances that will test on technology aspect. For example, if you have x-rays for mail screening, they will test as the real thing. And so you can package a box and scribble something on it in red Sharpie, or you can, kind of more grotesquely use the newspaper cutouts and like try to see if it gets flagged at any point in the process. And then within it, you can have X, Y, or Z, whether that's explosive device, mimics, or if it's just a suspicious substance that maybe is powder-like, so it would be closer aligned to like the anthrax type attacks or something similar. And again, multiple ways that you can test it. One can be people, right? Like someone has to put this package on the mail screening belt for the x-ray machine. Are they going to be like, okay, this looks weird, let me set it aside, let me call my supervisor, let me do whatever my process allegedly says that I have to do? That's one way to test it. And that's when the kind of handprints of an unsound person on it or a very angry person on it might be a red flag or a first red flag. And then we can test the actual technology. Hey, if we do X amount of this powder, or if we do Y amount of this item, will it trigger a warning on the technology side? And then, of course, there's mail screening dogs. If you have a big enough organization like bomb sniffing dogs, there's, substance dogs. And so it really depends who you're testing. But I want to be clear for anyone trying to do this at home, don't, first of all. Secondly, don't actually put your packages through the mail system. Whether you're using the federal agency, that is United States Postal Service, or the private companies like UPS or FedEx, don't actually mail them from your home to this company. You should find a safe way to hand off this mail, whether you get access of authorized access to the warehouse where you can just drop this box in with the rest of the deliveries from that day, or if the leadership representative who actually knows about this test walks it in and adds it to the pile. But yeah, do not put it through the mailing system. But there's many ways to do that. And the thing is, some of these people, if they're in powerful positions, they will receive death threats, they will receive hate mail, they will receive all sorts of vile things. And you want to be ahead of that because you want to protect against that. If someone is sitting at their desk reading their mail, the last thing they want is something unsightly to fall out of that envelope, or worse yet, something that could be very, very scary to fall out of that envelope. And so we'll do like a little dusting of something, and the goal is to find out, okay, does this get handled separately? Does this get alerted? Does the technology work? Does the human element work? Because you always have to test for multiple things. You're not ever really just focused on one. It all works in concert.
I'm curious how much you find that organizations have fallen into kind of a trap of security theater. They have machines, they have processes, they have a manual that tells them what to do, they have a big panic button on the wall, whatever it is, and they just assume that these things are effective, and are 9 times out of 10 maybe you're coming along going, that didn't do anything. Like, what is kind of the hit ratio, and how much is actually effective controls in your experience?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer this, right? One of the ways is that all of those things might work very well in isolation. So it's easy to say, oh, this vendor told me this would happen. And it's like, well, the example I like to use is this company that I was testing had just recently updated all of their access control systems. And so that was the actual electronic access control systems, like their badges, as well as the turnstiles and the perimeter controls, right? And so they have the state-of-the-art turnstiles, and they're installed in their office, and they work very well. Like, I couldn't even get like a step or half a foot inside one without a badge before it starts alarming, whether it's locally or at the operating center level. But what they didn't do was fit those controls to that environment. And that created an opening for me because they had a turnstile and a gap between the end of one turnstile and the wall of the building where they put a planter. And so with enough distraction, with enough action in the lobby, what I can do is just get behind that plant, or hop over that planter, which I cannot do over the turnstile. And so if they had just modified the technology to their space or modified the space to that technology more effectively, that would maybe increase their security. But just that element in itself isn't enough, right? You have to look at the system as a whole. And so I chuckled when you said the big red button. A lot of companies, especially in Silicon Valley, after the unfortunate YouTube shooting, have panic buttons, right? We have done a test where our goal was different and we were able to meet that objective. And then we're kind of talking to some of the stakeholders on site. And they're like, well, we have the panic buttons. And we're like, so do they work? Has anyone ever tested them? And they're like, well, no, we haven't had an incident. It's like, okay, so would it be okay to call the right people and make sure people know it's a test and then just push this button? And so we called the operating center. We set up, the right parameters. We're like, okay, we're here. This is a building. This is what's going to happen. This is what we expect to happen. It's going to shut down the perimeter doors. It's going to lock in the lobby. And, we already have ballistic film on the exterior, so it should be okay. But the SOC is going to receive this big old red button alert, right? And we're ready, and we have all the right people where they need to be in position, and we push the button and nothing happens. Nothing happens. And what we found out as a kind of lessons learned debrief was that no one configured the button to do all those things. And so whereas we had all the measure in place, like lockdown mechanisms were there and they do work, the film is there and it does work. And we have obviously all these technology lines to the responding teams and everything else, but that button was never configured to activate these things. And so imagine that you have a threat of an active shooter outside or anything else, like let's say protest, that requires you to shut down your lobby, and you push the panic button and you're like, oh, silence, nothing is happening. And so, yes, it is easy to think that everything works because you have some of the state of the art or some of the most modern technology. But if you don't test it, it doesn't matter if it's a good old, lock, key in the door type lock, or what we currently hear a lot is the AI technology, AI added to the end of everything. It doesn't mean that it works just because it works with your system and in your environment just because it works well. So the goal is to test your measures in concert and find out, okay, do all of these things together get me that safety that is my goal when I hand select them and choose them separately? Because, it is theater. I'm not going to dispute that. We're running into that ourselves. B, vendors have a job. And C, the security decision makers don't always have the best information. They have the vendor pitch, they might have some demos, but again, you're never going to get those things all aligned with whatever measures you have in place. But the testing of that entire system is where the red team comes in. Because you're saying like it's a little bit like capture the flag. It can be, right? If my goal, because there's 3 ways we do this. And if my goal is to get in and get out because I planted a device or I stole a server rack or I did whatever else incriminating thing that I was going to do, if my goal is to just do that and get out, I can do that. I'm not necessarily capturing flags along the way. But if my goal is to find out every way into the building or every way into an MDF closet or every way to just get into, this data center, then I'm going to go test your fences. I'm going to test your guards. I'm going to test your doors. I'm going to test your tailgates. And at every step of the way, I'm going to take note, this worked, this didn't work. This enabled me to be successful, which means that it's something that needs to be fixed. And so it really depends on the approach of the company. But even with the state of the art technology, without actually getting your hands on it, without testing it, there is no way to know if it works with you. So you have to ask a lot of questions and do some red button pushing.
I think that's a great point. I come from a world of, I used to do a lot of malware analysis and set up malware labs at a few different companies. And, be talking to people about ransomware threats, and they'd always say, oh, we've got these things and we've got these backups. And then, if they got hit by ransomware, they'd suddenly discover that no one had ever tested whether they can restore from the backups. They were backing up all the time and doing all these things, but then suddenly when, I think it's a Mike Tyson quote that everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face, that it's that kind of, in the actual moment, is this going to do the thing we want it to do? And we had a guy who goes by the handle Freaky Clown as a previous guest on the podcast, and he was talking about, again, kind of that physical security assessment. Company had spent a lot of money on a very secure door system with this big, air lock rotating door thing, and the engineer had left it in the debug setup mode. So once an hour, the entire thing opened, rotated, and then opened on the other side. So he just timed his footsteps to the seconds when it was rotating and walked straight through. And it invested, huge sums of money in all these biometric access controls and airlock door system. And again, it's those things that, has this been the setup incomplete? Have we actually tested out all the way through? So I think that's fascinating. I know we're kind of getting towards the end of the hour here, but I'm going to throw in the big week-long answer question, which is, you said at the start, one of the things that frustrated you when you were doing those early financial investigations, that the threat actors were so many steps ahead because they didn't have all the red tape and bureaucracy to work through. And kind of, you've got these legal, moral, and ethical lines, and your job, as I kind of see it, is to step right up to the edge of those lines, but not cross them. So, what are some of the fundamental things you do in terms of risk management to make sure you can be as realistic in your scenarios as possible, so the clients are getting the realistic view of their vulnerabilities without crossing those lines? Because I find that really hard to wrap my head around.
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and it's one of the several things that keeps me so invested in this job, is because it's a problem solving of a different problem every time. So you have to really understand the intricacies of how that particular client or organization works in order to be successful in getting your mitigation in place. But it is, it's like a muscle, right? Like once you start thinking about all the ways that things could go wrong, you start to kind of reverse engineer and make sure they're in place before you go. But some of the things that we do is we stop short of harm. So typically that means non-destructive entry. We're not going to, bulldoze your doors or fences or kind of blow out your doors to get into a place. Non-destructive entry, and of course, no harm to people. And so there's a little bit of that fine line that always stays sensitive, regardless of how much you do risk when it comes to social engineering and working with people. But that's a very big requirement of the job. So that's where a lot of the ethics come in, and you want to make sure you have those conversations with the team. You know where you stand, you know where your team stands, what the lines are. But for everything else, we just, again, no disrupting the business, no physical harm, and no destruction of any company assets. And then the nitty-gritty begins, right? So you talk to stakeholders and find out, okay, do they want me to be the person talking to legal and compliance and HR and, or do they want to just like relay some of these questions and get these answers? And we always like to do it ourselves just because we can explain so much better what we're trying to do. But yeah, it really is going to depend on your target. So if you're trying to get into an R&D lab, do you need protective eyewear for the lasers? Are there going to be substances there that, you're not a chemist, you're not going to know if you're going to get hurt? Do you need to have gloves? Do you need to have other protective gear? Or is that going to look goofy when you're trying to break into a place and you're fully in a lab outfit, right? And so understanding what you're dealing with, half the time we break into like a corporate office, and sometimes we're at like an oil rig. So you have to dress the part and also know what you're walking into, because the threat of matcha is non-existent at the oil rig, but you want to be prepared for the EHS part of things. Like if you need to have a hard hat, if you need to have like steel-toed shoes or whatever it is. And then of course there's the actual laws. So if you're recording anything, if you are to record something, We do a lot of proof of concept things. So like recording devices, obviously have capability to record, but we can just place it in a place and be like, hey, it has been here for X number of days, undisrupted or undiscovered, and you might want to do something about that. Or if we're dealing more with like the data center space, a lot of the time it's client or user data or patient data, right? Sometimes. And so you have to make sure that you're not violating any of those regulations. So you really have to get to know the client and what some of their pain points are and what they're having to deal with, and work from there. And that's not to say that your target isn't going to change or your actual like procession of the exercise or operation won't change, but having the big things addressed. So the actual state laws, the regulatory things, compliance things, EHS, armed personnel is a huge one, because a lot of, this is America, so we're seeing a lot of guard forces, maybe not a lot, but a significant chunk depending on, again, the client. We're seeing them armed, and we want to get ahead of that and make sure that our team stays safe, their team stays safe, right? And there's not room for any reputational risk in terms of, oh, shots were fired on the campus of this like large bank, for example, right? Like never, ever, ever want to be in that position. And so we have a lot of those conversations like, is personnel going to be armed? What is their training? What is their protocol? Are they empowered to just draw their weapon? Are they going to call 911? We want to fortify the relationships with the law enforcement locally. And so know that, whether it's like an on-call person or local sheriff, depending on, the jurisdiction there, we want to know, we want to inform them and prepare them for this test that it might happen, this week or in the next 6 weeks, but there might be a test, and like, these are the contacts that you want to get in touch with and kind of draw your conclusions from. So there's a lot of prep for that. We have what's called a letter of authorization, get out of jail free cards. They tend to document like, hey, this person in charge, authorized these people to do this test. It will happen in this window. This is their name. They will have an ID. If you encounter them, please call this number to verify the validity of this letter or whatever. And so we're very avid opponents of using fake get out of jail free cards, because we think it destroys the trust that you can very, very carefully build in this industry, right? But yeah, there's many ways that you can fortify your operation from all the external things that might happen, but it requires a lot of questions being asked. And again, like I said, I could talk about it for hours. We do publish a Red Team resource that kind of dives into this deeper if you're a practitioner, if you're just getting started in the field. So if anyone from your audience has questions about it, I'm happy to dive into it more. But yeah, ask lots of questions, meet people where they are, and then of course stay rooted in intelligence and in like your actual threat actor behavior, and try to stay close to that.
No. So I mean, it's fascinating there, and I think a lot of the communication skills you talked about earlier, and those relationship buildings are a big part of that de-risking it, making sure you know the right people, you've communicated things in the right way clearly so people understand. Just before we get to the end, one of the things I'm really intrigued by is, how do you recruit people who are both good at that kind of meticulous planning, going through things, but then are also really good, really quick to adapt when the situation changes on the ground? That seems like a sort of almost opposing skill set.
It can be. A lot of the times, and I've done probably more hiring for physical red teamers than anyone else I know. And in my time at Meta, I built one of the biggest Silicon Valley physical red teams, and then also hired consultants to kind of fortify our operations as necessary. But the short answer is we hire for aptitude and the mindset, as opposed to necessarily like very technical skills, right? There's a lot of room for that, but what you're going to see in red team operations is typically you draw from a pool of people that have very different skills. So a lot of us will have kind of a baseline set of like good enough at lockpicking, pretty decent at social engineering, can't do cloning or hacking of other kind, dangerous with cyber, right? And then you have someone who's like expert in each of those areas. And so you want to build your team based on what the client is looking for and what the operation actually is about. And so that's where the skills really come in. But you do have a lot of checks and balances before you ever get on the ground. And that's what I've always advocated for is we're not going to just be like, okay, we have a mission, let's go. Like, no, we're going to debrief the mission. We're going to rehearse it. Everyone's going to have a role in it and know their role in it. And then we can go on the ground, right? And so it prepares even those of us who are not necessarily very process prone because they have an expectation of what comes next. And so it kind of goes back to something I was saying earlier in the call. If you want to, you want to be prepared for these basic things like HR and compliance and regulatory, because so many things go differently on the ground than you expected, that you want your attention and focus on those and kind of matching the rest of the operations tone to it, to the solution that you put forward, as opposed to being like, oh, well, did we ever clear this? Or is my gear charged? Or do I know where I go once I get in here? Like, there's plenty of ambiguity and unknowns when you get foot on the ground, but we want to eliminate as many of those predictable aspects of it as possible so that you can focus on being creative and you can be responsible and you have like psychological space to navigate in an effective way, remembering that you're part of a team and you have a mission, and it's an important one. So yeah, we play a lot, but we also practice a lot, and ultimately that makes you far more successful in the field. But you can't just dive into an assessment off the bat and hope that someone carries their weight. You want to prepare them for what that weight looks like.
That's fantastic. And I really enjoy the fact that in the background there's some sirens going off as you were just talking to about adapting to the situation.
San Francisco living for you.
Always adapting, yeah. So before we wrap this up, if people want to learn more about your work, find out more about you or Pine Risk Management, where's the best place to go to find that?
My last name is a mouthful, so you can just go to pinerisk.com and find me through there. Otherwise, LinkedIn is a good place to find me, as is Twitter. And my handle is, again, not very easy to spell, but it's unauthorized. So it's unauthorized like unauthorized access, but with an A for Ana instead of the U. So
we'll include links to it in the podcast description for anyone interested who can't remember all the spellings there. But look, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. I think we need to get you back on because there's so many more things we could possibly explore. There's the sirens of San Francisco again wrapping us up. So that's all we have time today for on Adventures of Alice and Bob. Thanks to our guest, Ana Aslanishvili. I really think her passion for advancing red team engagement, taking a holistic approach to this in the physical red teaming world, is truly contagious. And anyone who's interested in starting or enhancing their career in this area really should check out pinerisk.com. Look at the publications, look at the research they've got on there, because they're sharing these things in an effort to keep us all safer and make us all better in the industry. So really appreciate everything you're doing there, Ana. And as always, thanks to our super producer, Jesse, and the team at BeyondTrust who make this podcast happen. I'm James Maud, and this has been Adventures of Alice and Bob.